And joining me now is someone who knows a lot about Russian information operations, Cipher Brief Expert and former senior member of the British Foreign Office, Nick Fishwick. Nick, I'm very interested on your perspective on what's happening with Russian information operations, with covert operations. You've been dealing with this in the UK for decades. What is it that you think Americans need to know about how active these measures really are?
I think they need to know that it's a threat to their way of life, it's a threat to their society, it's a threat to their deepest values. I think one of the deepest values that we share in common with the United States and our European partners and other countries as well is a belief in democracy and a knowledge that democracy is fair and it works. And the Russians are trying to undermine that. Now, as you said, Suzanne, I've looked at that for many years personally. We know that going right back to the early days of the Soviet Union, the 1920s and before, the Russians were actively using propaganda attempts to influence public opinion, to undermine our democracy. But I think now it's more serious than it's been at any stage, at least since the 1950s, because I think the Putin regime is under more threat than it's been before. Therefore, the Russians see it as more of an existential battle. In any way that they can hurt us, they think that's an automatic gain for them. And because Putin is under so much pressure now, he's fighting harder and he's fighting dirtier. And I think people need to remember that it will affect their way of life. It will affect their ability to have free elections that they can rely on, media that they can rely on, and therefore a shared culture, which is what Western democracy should have.
There's already at this moment so little trust in sources of information by Americans at large. It seems like that is an issue. Nick, let me ask you, it's difficult for people to really understand something when they don't see how it comes together. But there are allegations within this latest indictment, for example, where Russia is sometimes bringing in other people unwittingly. They might not even know that Russia is funding these operations. How are they so successful at this time after time after time?
Well, I would think that using people unwittingly increases your scope for influence. The number of people who are going to do this willingly is, thank God, it's quite low. Therefore, what you're going to do is to try and broaden that network by just using people who don't know what's happening, who think they're getting some moral or financial support from a media organisation that they're running, or somebody who happens to believe in the same thing as them, without asking questions about where the person that's offering this wonderful help is coming from. So I think using people who are not aware that it's under Russian government control enhances the scope for the Russians to use more people to influence our views.
And it's difficult as the consumer of information to sometimes know what questions to ask about where you're getting your sources of information from. How do you think about it from the information consumer perspective? What do you think about when you're trying to sort of critically assess your sources of information and what you believe when we're living in an age where people get their news online now? It's no longer the old days of the newspapers.
I think number one, I would ask critical questions about the media that I'm relying on. So, frankly, if I'm looking online at most newspapers, British and American and European newspapers, I know what I'm dealing with, and I know there's a basic respect for truth. It does vary a bit from newspaper to newspaper. I know that with the BBC and the leading Western media organisations. Some are less well clear than that, and I think if I was relying on them, I'd just do a bit of research into who they are, who controls them, where they're based. I'd also just use my antennae. What's my own kind of antennae? So what British school children are taught to do now is to try and be critical in when they read things. So why are they being told this? Why are these particular words being used? So that even school children are being taught to develop their critical faculties to ask questions about whether what's in front of them is reliable or not. Does something strike you as being strange? Is it likely to be in somebody's interest that this story is being there? If you see photographs, you can doctor photographs in incredibly sophisticated ways these days, but if a photograph seems a bit weird, I would ask a question about whether that photograph is genuine or not.
One of the other measures that Russians have been known to use is not necessarily creating chaos or division, but simply exploiting chaos or division that already exists. What lessons do you have from how you've seen that play out here in the UK for the US?
Well, I mean, number one, they will target people who are saying things which they think not necessarily are in their interest, but which are against our interests, and they will try and manipulate things that they're saying to cause disruption. They will use quite a substantial amount of money to do that. If they think it's going to have real impact, they will spend quite a lot of money. They will try and hide the source of that money, so it won't come in a big, swag bag with SVR written all over it. It'll be harder to spot than that. So there are lots of different things that they can do. And also, of course, the media that they use is way more diverse than it was when I was a young person starting off working for the British government. So they will use lots of different media as receptacles for money, for influence, for people who they insert or they unwittingly use to advance the messages that they want to get over.
I don't know if this is an easy answer or not. I'm guessing not, but how do you stop this as a government, Nick?
We started this conversation by you asking me about whether people are taking it seriously enough. I think they're not. And I think government has a responsibility, our government and Western European governments and governments like the US and other allies, to make it clear what is at stake here. It's not a bit of niche influence or intelligence work by the Russians. It's going to the heart of our lives. And I'd give you an example of what's worrying about politics in Britain and Europe. What people worry about is extreme right-wing politics. They worry about extreme left-wing politics as well, but we had riots in this country that seemed to be about nationalists who wanted to get their point of view over, in a few cases violently. The Russians will be desperate to exploit that, and some of these extreme right political groups are getting support of different sorts from the Russians. Now, I'm not saying they're invalid and illegitimate. They will have proper support by people who believe in whatever it is that those people are propagating, but there'll be lots of ways in which the Russians are trying to manipulate that, and from my perspective and from many other people's perspectives, that is eroding the consensus and the centre ground in Western politics, and that's eroding our ability to function as a democracy moving forward together. So people should be aware that extremist organisations, or just quite extreme organisations, in the UK, in Europe, in other parts of the world, probably in the US as well, are being manipulated by the Russians, and they're being manipulated as never before, using sources that have not been used before, using amounts of money that's not been available before, and by using media that's much harder for Westerners to be aware of. So we need awareness, we need politicians to give a lead on this, to make speeches about it, to encourage the media to look into these things. Our consciousness needs to be raised.
In the US, there was a congressionally appointed bipartisan group of national security experts and leaders who just filed a report saying that Americans in general really have no idea about the seriousness of the threats facing them today. Do you have a similar issue in the UK? And if so, what's the answer to that?
Well, I don't know whether it's a congressional report, but yes, we do, as I've been saying, have at least as serious a problem as that. We're a very cynical people, the British, so when people start talking about Russian influence, I think a lot of British people, I suspect particularly young people, are disinclined to believe it. So I think there's no dramatic answer to this, but I think the only answer that's going to work is it becoming an issue of policy, it becoming an issue of security. As I say, politicians talking about it, there need to be debates about it in the House of Commons, there need to be articles about it in mainstream British media and other respectable media. So we just need our consciousness raising in lots of ways like that. Probably other people can think of smarter ways. If it doesn't get done by people with smarter ideas than I've got for doing it, we're going to keep facing extremist politics, undermining our ways of life, and that's playing absolutely into Putin's playbook.
Yeah. Nick Fishwick, former senior member of the British Foreign Office, and very proud to call you a Cipher Brief Expert. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks, a pleasure.